In the grand hallways of Buckingham Palace, where every footstep echoes with centuries of history, Captain James Morrison had walked the same patrol route for 12 years. He knew every creaking floorboard, every shadow cast by the ornate chandeliers, every sound that belonged, and every one that didn't. But on this ordinary Tuesday morning in March, he would encounter something that would transform him from a silent guardian into an unlikely hero. It started with the sound of children's laughter drifting from the private wing. Innocent, joyful, and completely wrong for that time of day. The royal children should have been in their morning lessons, not playing in the restricted corridor near the Queen's private chambers. Something was about to unfold that would test every instinct Morrison had developed as a protector of the crown, and challenge everything he thought he knew about duty, courage, and the true meaning of service. What began as a routine morning would become a story whispered through palace halls for years to come. The day a royal guard's split-second decision changed the course of history, and revealed that sometimes the most extraordinary acts of bravery happen in the most unexpected moments. Captain James Morrison adjusted his red tunic one final time before beginning his morning patrol through the east wing of Buckingham Palace. The March sunlight streamed through the massive windows, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. At 42 years old, Morrison had served the royal family for over a decade, earning his position through unwavering dedication and an almost supernatural ability to sense trouble before it arrived. The palace buzzed with its usual morning energy. Staff members moved efficiently through the corridors, preparing for another day of royal duties. Morrison nodded to familiar faces as he passed. Mary from housekeeping, who always had a warm smile despite her early shifts, and Thomas from the kitchen staff, who carried a silver tray loaded with the morning tea service. Everything seemed perfectly normal, exactly as it should be in the carefully orchestrated world of royal protocol. Morrison's trained eye automatically scanned every detail as he walked. Security was paramount here, not just because of external threats, but because the palace housed some of the most precious individuals in the British Commonwealth. The royal children, in particular, required constant vigilance. 8-year-old Prince William and 6-year-old Prince Harry were known for their adventurous spirits and tendency to explore areas where they shouldn't venture. The morning lessons were scheduled to begin at 9 o'clock sharp in the schoolroom located in the north wing. Morrison glanced at his watch. 8:45. The children should be finishing their breakfast and preparing to meet their tutors. The private family quarters would be settling into the quiet rhythm that marked the beginning of the academic day. As Morrison turned the corner into the long corridor that connected the private chambers to the staterooms, something caught his attention. The sound was subtle at first, muffled voices coming from somewhere they shouldn't be. His years of training had taught him to distinguish between normal household sounds and those that signaled potential problems. This definitely fell into the latter category. The voices were young, clearly belonging to children, but they weren't coming from the direction of the breakfast room or the schoolroom. Instead, they seemed to originate from the restricted area near the Queen's private study, a section of the palace where only senior staff and family members were permitted to enter. Morrison felt his pulse quicken slightly as he quickened his pace, his polished boots clicking against the marble with increased urgency. The Queen's private study contained sensitive documents, priceless artifacts, and communication equipment that connected directly to government security networks. It was not a place for children to play, regardless of their royal status. More concerning still was the fact that this area of the palace was supposed to be secured during morning hours while Her Majesty attended to correspondence with government officials. Morrison reached the ornate double doors that marked the entrance to the restricted wing and paused to listen more carefully. The voices were definitely those of Prince William and Prince Harry, but there was something else. Adult voices speaking in urgent, hushed tones. His training kicked in immediately as he recognized that these were not the familiar accents of palace staff members. The inflection was different, foreign, and carried an undertone that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Moving with the silent precision that had been drilled into him during his military service before joining the Royal Guard, Morrison approached the partially open door to the Queen's study. What he saw through the narrow gap between the door and its frame made his blood run cold. 3 men in maintenance uniforms were inside the study, but they were not engaged in any kind of repair work. Instead, they were systematically photographing documents spread across the Queen's desk with small, professional cameras. One man stood guard by the window, while another worked quickly to copy files from what appeared to be a secure filing cabinet that had been skillfully opened. Prince William and Prince Harry sat in the corner of the room, their faces pale and frightened. They weren't playing, or exploring, as Morrison had initially assumed. They had obviously wandered into the room at the wrong time and discovered the intruders in the act. The children were being held quietly in place by the third man, who stood between them and the door with a hand resting meaningfully on something concealed beneath his jacket. Morrison's mind raced as he processed the situation. These were not random burglars or opportunistic thieves. The precision of their operation, their knowledge of the palace layout, and their ability to bypass multiple security measures indicated professional training and advanced planning. They were conducting espionage at the highest level, photographing sensitive government documents that could compromise national security. The safety of the royal children took immediate priority over everything else. Morrison had sworn an oath to protect the royal family with his life, and that oath had never felt more real or urgent than it did in this moment. However, he also understood that any rash action could endanger the children further. The man guarding them had already demonstrated that he was prepared to use force if necessary. Morrison carefully assessed his options while remaining hidden from view. He could retreat and summon backup, but that would take precious minutes during which the intruders could complete their mission and potentially harm the children. He could attempt to create a distraction that would draw the men away from William and Harry, but that carried enormous risk if the plan failed. Or he could try to negotiate, though his training told him that professional operatives rarely responded well to attempts at peaceful resolution. The decision was made for him when Prince Harry, perhaps emboldened by childhood bravery or simply frightened beyond measure, suddenly stood up and ran toward what he thought was the way out. The movement startled the guard, who spun around and reached for the concealed weapon beneath his jacket. In that split second, Morrison knew that hesitation would cost lives. He burst through the door with the full force of his military training behind him. His first priority was creating space between the armed man and the children. Morrison launched himself across the room, using his body as a shield while shouting for William and Harry to get behind the heavy oak desk that dominated the center of the study. The man with the camera equipment dropped his equipment and reached for his own weapon, while the lookout by the window spun around in surprise. Morrison had the advantage of momentum and familiarity with the room's layout, but he was outnumbered 3-1, and the safety of 2 young children hung in the balance. The next few seconds unfolded with the brutal clarity that comes with life-or-death situations. Morrison tackled the guard who had been watching the children, driving him away from William and Harry, while simultaneously grabbing for the weapon the man was trying to draw. They crashed into a priceless antique cabinet, sending china and crystal cascading to the floor in a symphony of destruction. Prince William, showing remarkable presence of mind for an 8-year-old, grabbed his younger brother's hand and pulled him toward the heavy desk, as Morrison had instructed. The boys crouched behind the solid wood barrier just as the first gunshot echoed through the room, the sound deafeningly loud in the enclosed space. Morrison felt a burning sensation across his shoulder as he grappled with the first attacker, but adrenaline kept him moving. Years of combat training took over as he fought to disarm the man while keeping himself between the other 2 intruders and the children's hiding place. The ornate study, normally a place of quiet contemplation and diplomatic correspondence, had transformed into a battlefield. The man by the window was moving toward the children's position, weapon drawn, while his companion with the photography equipment was gathering the cameras and documents in an attempt to salvage their mission. Morrison realized with crystal clarity that the next few moments would determine whether he succeeded in protecting William and Harry or failed in the most catastrophic way possible. With a surge of determination fueled by his oath of service and his own protective instincts, Morrison threw his full weight into the fight, knowing that surrender was not an option and that the lives of 2 precious children depended entirely on his actions in the next crucial minutes. The ancient floorboards of the Queen's study groaned under the weight of the violent struggle as Morrison fought desperately to maintain his position between the armed intruders and the 2 young princes. His shoulder burned where the bullet had grazed him, but military training had taught him to compartmentalize pain during combat. Right now, nothing mattered except keeping William and Harry safe. Morrison managed to wrench the pistol away from the first attacker, sending it skittering across the polished floor toward the fireplace. The man cursed in what sounded like Eastern European accent and immediately pulled a knife from his belt, the blade glinting menacingly in the morning sunlight. Behind the oak desk, Morrison could hear the children's frightened breathing, and that sound fueled his determination more than any training or oath ever could. The second intruder was advancing steadily toward the desk where the princes were hidden, his own weapon trained on Morrison. The man's eyes were cold and professional, calculating the best angle of attack. Morrison realized that he was dealing with trained operatives who had planned this mission carefully and were prepared to kill anyone who interfered with their objectives. "You cannot stop all of us," the advancing man said in heavily accented English, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Move away from the children and you might live." Morrison's response was immediate and uncompromising. He grabbed the heavy crystal paperweight from the Queen's desk and hurled it with deadly accuracy at the man's gun hand. The crystal struck with a sharp crack, causing the weapon to discharge harmlessly into the ceiling as the intruder instinctively jerked his hand back in pain. Using the moment of distraction, Morrison dove toward the second man while simultaneously shouting to the children, "Stay down! Don't move until I tell you!" His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations, and both princes pressed themselves lower behind the protective barrier of the desk. The knife-wielding attacker lunged forward, aiming for Morrison's ribs, but the captain had fought men with blades before during his military service in Northern Ireland. He caught the man's wrist and twisted sharply, using leverage and body weight to redirect the attack. The knife blade scraped against his uniform jacket, leaving a long tear, but missing flesh by mere inches. Meanwhile, the third intruder had abandoned his photography equipment and was now reaching for a backup weapon. Morrison caught a glimpse of sophisticated spy cameras and what appeared to be classified government documents scattered across the floor, evidence of how thoroughly the operation had been planned. These men had somehow gained access to the most secure areas of Buckingham Palace and had been in the process of photographing state secrets when the children accidentally discovered them. The man whose gun hand Morrison had injured was now fumbling to retrieve his fallen weapon with his uninjured hand. Morrison knew he had perhaps seconds before facing armed opponents from multiple directions. The knife attacker pressed his advantage, forcing Morrison to focus on the immediate threat while the other two regrouped. Morrison feinted left, then spun right, using the man's momentum against him as he drove his elbow into the attacker's solar plexus. The knife clattered to the floor as the man doubled over, gasping for breath. Without hesitation, Morrison scooped up the blade and turned to face the remaining threats. The injured man had succeeded in retrieving his pistol and was now aiming it directly at Morrison's chest. Time seemed to slow as the captain realized he was about to be shot at point-blank range. In that crystalline moment, he made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of diving for cover, he deliberately stepped sideways to ensure that his body remained between the gunman and the children. The shot rang out like thunder in the enclosed room. Morrison felt the impact like a sledgehammer blow to his chest, driving him backward against the Queen's bookshelf. Leather-bound volumes that had belonged to generations of monarchs tumbled around him as he fought to remain upright. Blood began to seep through his red uniform tunic, but he was still alive, still conscious, and still standing between the intruders and their targets. Prince William's young voice carried clearly from behind the desk, filled with a courage that belied his 8 years. "Leave him alone. He's protecting us." The boy's defiance in the face of such danger would have made Morrison proud under different circumstances, but right now, it only increased his desperation to end the threat before the children were harmed. The third attacker had finally located his weapon and was now advancing from Morrison's left flank. The captain found himself caught in a crossfire with limited mobility due to his wounds. His vision was starting to blur slightly from blood loss, but his resolve remained unshakable. He had sworn an oath to protect the royal family, and that oath would be honored regardless of personal cost. Morrison gathered his remaining strength and launched himself at the nearest attacker with the knife he had recovered. The blade found its mark in the man's shoulder, causing him to cry out and drop his weapon. But the effort cost Morrison dearly. His chest wound was bleeding more heavily now, and he could feel his strength ebbing with each heartbeat. The remaining two intruders were regrouping, their mission clearly compromised, but their determination to eliminate witnesses still evident. Morrison could see in their eyes that they had made the cold calculation that killing everyone in the room was now their only option for escape. It was then that the sound Morrison had been praying to hear finally reached his ears, running footsteps in the corridor outside, accompanied by shouted commands and the distinctive jingle of equipment that marked the approach of additional security personnel. Someone had heard the gunshots and raised the alarm. The lead intruder's eyes darted toward the door, calculating chances of escape. Morrison saw the moment of decision cross the man's face and knew that the next few seconds would be critical. Wounded as he was, he summoned every ounce of remaining strength for what might be his final effort to protect the princes. "Armed intruders in the Queen's study," Morrison shouted as loudly as his damaged chest would allow. "Protect the children." His voice carried down the corridor, providing crucial information to the approaching security team, while also serving notice to the attackers that their time was running out. The nearest intruder raised his weapon again, this time aiming directly at the desk where William and Harry were hidden. Morrison's heart nearly stopped as he realized the man intended to eliminate the witnesses before attempting to escape. With his last reserves of strength, the captain threw himself forward, intercepting the line of fire just as the trigger was pulled. The second bullet hit Morrison in the abdomen, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the Queen's writing desk. Precious documents scattered to the floor as blood pooled beneath him. But his sacrifice had bought precious seconds, and now the distinctive voices of additional guards could be heard just outside the door. The intruders made their decision. Instead of continuing the fight, they bolted toward the window, where rope was already prepared for their escape route. The operation had clearly been planned with multiple contingencies, including emergency exits, that bypassed normal palace security measures. As Morrison lay wounded on the floor, fighting to remain conscious, he heard the sound of boots entering the study, and Prince William's voice calling out, "Here! We're here! Captain Morrison saved us!" The 8-year-old emerged from behind the desk with his younger brother, both boys rushing to Morrison's side despite the danger that might still remain. The last thing Morrison remembered before darkness claimed him was Prince Harry's small hand gently touching his face, while the boy whispered, "Don't die, Captain. Please, don't die." Those words would echo in Morrison's mind throughout the long recovery that lay ahead, a reminder of why his sacrifice had been necessary and worthwhile. The familiar beeping of hospital monitors gradually pulled Captain James Morrison back to consciousness 3 days after the incident in the Queen's study. The private room in Westminster Hospital was filled with flowers from well-wishers, but his first coherent thought was not about his own condition. It was wondering whether Prince William and Prince Harry were safe. A nurse noticed his awakening and immediately called for the doctor. But before medical personnel could arrive, Morrison saw a familiar figure sitting quietly in the chair beside his bed. Detective Inspector Sarah Chen from Scotland Yard Special Branch had been waiting patiently for him to regain consciousness, her notebook ready to capture his account of the events that had sent shockwaves through the highest levels of British government. "Captain Morrison," she said gently, leaning forward with obvious relief. "How are you feeling? The doctor said you were very fortunate. The chest wound missed your heart by centimeters, and while the abdominal injury was serious, no vital organs were permanently damaged." Morrison tried to speak, but found his throat dry and raw. Chen immediately offered him water, waiting while he managed a few careful sips. When he finally found his voice, his first words were exactly what she had expected. "The children. Are William and Harry safe?" "They're perfectly safe," Chen assured him immediately. "Thanks entirely to your actions. They were unharmed and are back with their family under enhanced security protection. In fact, Prince William has been asking about you every day since the incident. He wants to visit as soon as the doctors clear it." Relief flooded through Morrison's system more effectively than any painkiller. Everything else, his injuries, the investigation, even his own future, seemed secondary to knowing that his actions had achieved their primary objective. The children were safe, and that made everything worthwhile. Chen opened her notebook and settled back in her chair. "I know you're still recovering, but we need to understand exactly what happened in that room. What you encountered was not a random break-in, Captain. This was a sophisticated espionage operation that had been planned for months, possibly years." Morrison's mind was still somewhat foggy from medication, but the memories of those terrifying minutes in the Queen's study were crystal clear. He began recounting the events from the moment he heard the children's voices in the wrong location, describing each detail with the precision that his military training had ingrained in him. "The men you encountered were professional operatives," Chen explained as Morrison finished his account. "We've identified them as members of a foreign intelligence service, though which specific country is still classified. They had somehow obtained detailed blueprints of the palace, including security schedules and patrol routes. Your presence that morning was the one variable they hadn't accounted for." The scope of the security breach was staggering to Morrison. How did they get inside? The palace security is supposed to be impenetrable. Chen's expression grew grim. "They had help from inside. We've arrested 2 staff members who were providing information and assistance. The investigation is ongoing, but it appears this operation was designed to photograph specific documents related to NATO defense strategies and intelligence sharing agreements. If they had succeeded, the damage to national security would have been immeasurable." Morrison absorbed this information slowly, understanding for the first time the true magnitude of what the children had accidentally stumbled into. William and Harry hadn't just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. They had inadvertently discovered an act of espionage that could have altered the balance of international power. "The children," Morrison said, his voice still weak but filled with concern. "How are they handling all this?" "They must have been terrified." Chen smiled for the first time since entering the room. Actually, they've been remarkably resilient. Prince William has told everyone who will listen about your heroism, and Prince Harry has been drawing pictures of what he calls the brave captain to send to you. Their parents are incredibly grateful, obviously, but they're also very proud of how both boys behaved during the crisis. The mention of the royal children's resilience brought Morrison both comfort and concern. Children were remarkably adaptable, but traumatic experiences could have long-lasting effects that might not manifest immediately. He hoped they would receive appropriate counseling and support to process what they had witnessed. Patricia Williams, Morrison's attending physician, entered the room during their conversation, clearly pleased to see her patient awake and alert. After conducting a thorough examination and expressing satisfaction with his progress, she provided an update on his condition that was more encouraging than Morrison had dared hope. The surgery went very well, Dr. Williams explained. We were able to repair all the damage from both gunshot wounds. You'll have a long recovery ahead, probably 3 months before you're back to full duty. But there shouldn't be any permanent limitations on your physical capabilities. 3 months of recovery seemed like a small price to pay for the lives of 2 children and the protection of national security secrets. Morrison was already mentally preparing for the rehabilitation process when Chen delivered news that surprised him. Captain Morrison, I need to inform you that your actions have attracted attention at the highest levels of government. The Prime Minister has personally reviewed the incident report, and there will likely be official recognition of your heroism. Additionally, the royal family has requested a private audience with you once you're well enough for visitors. The prospect of meeting with the royal family under these circumstances felt surreal to Morrison. Throughout his career as a guard, he had maintained the professional distance that protocol required. He had protected them, but always from a respectful remove. The idea of a personal audience was both honor and responsibility that he wasn't sure how to process. Chen continued. There's something else you should know. The intruders who escaped through the window were apprehended 6 hours later trying to leave the country. The one you wounded in the study provided significant intelligence about their operation once he realized the severity of the charges he was facing. Morrison felt a grim satisfaction at this news. The men who had threatened the children and national security would face justice, and their capture meant that the network they represented could be further investigated and dismantled. What about the documents they photographed? Morrison asked. Did they manage to transmit anything before we stopped them? That's still being investigated, Chen replied carefully. Some photos were taken, but thanks to your intervention, they didn't have time to complete their mission or transmit the images. The damage assessment is ongoing, but initial indications suggest you prevented a catastrophic intelligence breach. As Chen prepared to leave, promising to return the following day with additional questions, Morrison found himself thinking about the moment when everything changed. One instant he had been conducting a routine patrol through familiar corridors, and the next he was fighting for the lives of 2 children and the security of his nation. The choices he had made in those crucial minutes felt inevitable in retrospect, driven by training, duty, and an instinctive protective response that went beyond professional obligation. But he also understood that he had been extraordinarily fortunate. The situation could easily have ended with the children dead and the intruders successful in their mission. Dr. Williams returned that evening with additional information about his recovery timeline and the physical therapy that would be required. As she spoke about muscle regeneration and strength-building exercises, Morrison's thoughts kept returning to Prince William's brave defiance in the face of armed men and Prince Harry's tearful concern for his welfare as he lay wounded on the study floor. Those images would stay with him forever, reminders of why his sacrifice had been necessary and worthwhile. The boys had shown courage beyond their years, and he had been privileged to play a role in protecting their innocence and their future. As Morrison drifted back to sleep that night, he carried with him the knowledge that when the moment of truth arrived, he had been ready to fulfill his oath of service, regardless of personal cost. 2 weeks after the incident, Captain Morrison received an unexpected visitor that would change his perspective on the events that had unfolded in the Queen's study. Prince William, accompanied by a discreet security detail and his personal tutor, arrived at Westminster Hospital with a carefully prepared speech and a handmade card that he had been working on since the day after the attack. The 8-year-old prince approached Morrison's bedside with the formal bearing he had been taught for official occasions, but his eyes sparkled with the genuine affection of a child who understood that this man had risked everything to protect him. In his hands he carried a drawing that depicted Morrison in his Red Guard uniform standing protectively in front of 2 small figures, with the words, "My Hero," written in careful block letters across the top. "Captain Morrison," William began, his young voice clear and steady, "I wanted to thank you properly for what you did. Mama and Papa said you were very brave, and I want you to know that Harry and I will never forget how you protected us." Morrison felt his throat tighten with emotion as he accepted the drawing, studying the careful details the boy had included. The accurate red uniform, the palace setting, even the fierce determination William had somehow captured in the stick figure's expression. It was clear that the prince had put considerable thought and effort into creating this tribute. "Your Highness," Morrison replied formally, then caught himself and spoke more naturally. "William, it was my honor to protect you and your brother. That's what we guards are here for, to keep you safe, so you can grow up to be the men your parents know you can become." Prince Harry, who had been somewhat shy since arriving, suddenly stepped forward with his own contribution, a small toy soldier painted in the colors of the Royal Guard. "This is for you," he said seriously, "so you remember that guards are the bravest people in the world." The gifts from the children meant more to Morrison than any official commendation could. These were tokens of genuine gratitude from the individuals he had protected, personal acknowledgements of the bond that had been forged in those terrifying minutes when their lives hung in the balance. Their tutor, Miss Eleanor Blackwood, had been observing the exchange with professional interest. A former child psychologist who specialized in helping young people process traumatic experiences, she had been working with both princes to ensure they could integrate what they had witnessed without lasting psychological damage. "Captain Morrison," she said, "I hope you don't mind, but I've been helping William and Harry understand what happened that day. They've shown remarkable resilience, but they've also expressed a strong desire to understand why people would want to hurt them and what your actions meant in the larger context." Morrison looked at the two young faces watching him expectantly and realized they deserved honest answers, appropriately delivered for their age level. These children would one day carry significant responsibilities for their nation, and early exposure to the realities of their position, while difficult, was also necessary preparation. "Sometimes," Morrison began carefully, "there are people who try to steal important secrets that could help other countries and hurt our country. They thought the Queen's study would be a good place to find those secrets. You boys just happened to discover them while they were doing something very wrong." William nodded solemnly. "And they would have gotten away with it if we hadn't found them, wouldn't they? But then they got angry at us for catching them." The boy's understanding of the situation was more sophisticated than Morrison had expected, suggesting that William had been thinking deeply about the implications of what had occurred. This level of analytical thinking, while impressive, also concerned Morrison children, shouldn't have to grapple with such adult concepts of betrayal and national security. "That's right," Morrison confirmed. "But the important thing is that they didn't succeed, and now they can't hurt anyone else. You boys were very brave that day, but I hope you never have to be that brave again." Harry, who had been listening intently, suddenly asked a question that cut straight to the heart of Morrison's own ongoing struggles. "Did it hurt when they shot you? Were you scared?" Morrison considered his answer carefully, understanding that his response could influence how these children processed their own fears about the experience. "Yes, it hurt," he said honestly. "And I was scared, not for myself, but for you and William. I was scared that I might not be strong enough or fast enough to keep you safe. But sometimes when people we care about are in danger, we find strength we didn't know we had." Miss Blackwood smiled approvingly at Morrison's response, recognizing his instinctive understanding of how to communicate complex emotional truths to children. The boys seemed satisfied with his honesty, and Morrison sensed that his admission of fear had somehow made his heroism more real and relatable to them. The visit continued for another 30 minutes, during which the princes shared details about their daily routines, their lessons, and their upcoming activities. Morrison was struck by how normal they seemed, despite the extraordinary circumstances of their lives and the recent trauma they had endured. Their resilience was a testament to their upbringing and the support system surrounding them. As the visit concluded, Prince William approached Morrison's bedside one final time with an unexpected proposal. "Captain Morrison, when you're better and back to work, could you teach Harry and me some of the things you know about protection? Papa says we should learn to defend ourselves, and we want to learn from the best." The request caught Morrison off guard, but he recognized the wisdom behind it. Teaching the princes basic self-defense and situational awareness could provide them with both practical skills and the confidence that came from feeling prepared for dangerous situations. "I would be honored to teach you," Morrison replied. "But first you have to promise me that you'll continue working hard at your regular studies. The best protection for people in your position is knowledge and wisdom, not just physical strength." Both boys solemnly promised to maintain their academic efforts, And Morrison found himself looking forward to a future role that extended beyond simple guard duty. Teaching the princes would allow him to contribute to their development as future leaders while also ensuring they had the tools to protect themselves in dangerous situations. After the princes left, Morrison spent considerable time reflecting on the conversation and its implications.
The boys had clearly been affected by their experience, but they had also gained something valuable, an early understanding of the responsibilities that came with their positions and the reality that protection required both personal courage and institutional support.
Dr. Williams visited that evening and noted significant improvement in Morrison's emotional state following the royal visit. Having those children confirm that your sacrifices were worthwhile seems to have been exactly the medicine you needed, she observed. Your physical recovery is proceeding well, but I was concerned about the psychological impact of such a traumatic experience. Today's visit appears to have provided important closure. Morrison understood what she meant. The validation from William and Harry had confirmed that his actions had achieved their primary objective, protecting innocent children who had found themselves in an extraordinarily dangerous situation through no fault of their own. Their gratitude and resilience had transformed his memories of the incident from a source of trauma into a source of pride and purpose. That night, as Morrison looked at the drawing William had given him, he began planning the self-defense curriculum he would develop for the princes. It would need to be age-appropriate while still being practical, engaging enough to hold their attention, while also instilling the serious mindset required for personal security. The incident had changed Morrison's role from silent guardian to active mentor, and he embraced this evolution with the same dedication he had brought to his protection duties. The boys deserved every advantage he could provide as they navigated the unique challenges of their royal responsibilities. 6 months after the incident in the Queen's study, Captain Morrison stood at attention in the Grand Throne Room of Buckingham Palace, wearing his dress uniform adorned with the George Cross, the highest civilian award for gallantry that could be bestowed upon a member of the armed forces. The ceremony recognizing his heroism had attracted representatives from across the Commonwealth, along with senior members of Parliament and the military establishment. Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth herself presented the award, her words carrying the weight of centuries of royal tradition as she spoke about courage, duty, and the protection of the innocent.
But for Morrison, the most meaningful moment came when Prince William and Prince Harry, now 9 and 7 respectively, stood beside their grandmother and added their own words of gratitude to the formal proceedings.
Captain Morrison didn't just save our lives, Prince William said with remarkable composure for a child addressing such a distinguished audience.
He showed us what it means to put other people's safety before your own. He taught us that real courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right even when you are afraid. The months of recovery and reflection had transformed Morrison's understanding of his role within the Royal Protection Services. No longer was he simply a silent guardian maintaining distance and protocol. He had become a trusted mentor and teacher to the 2 young princes, helping them develop both practical skills and the philosophical framework they would need as future leaders. The self-defense lessons Morrison had promised during his hospital stay had evolved into comprehensive training sessions that covered situational awareness, basic physical protection techniques, and, most importantly, decision-making under pressure. Working with child development experts and other security professionals, he had created a program that prepared the princes for potential dangers while allowing them to maintain the relative normalcy their parents desired for their childhood. Prince Harry, despite being the younger of the 2, had shown particular aptitude for the practical aspects of personal security. His natural athleticism and fearlessness served him well in learning defensive techniques, though Morrison was careful to emphasize that these skills were tools of last resort. The primary focus remained on recognizing dangerous situations and avoiding them when possible. Detective Inspector Chen, who had become a regular visitor during Morrison's recovery, attended the ceremony as both a representative of Scotland Yard and a personal friend. The investigation into the espionage attempt had revealed the full scope of the operation, leading to arrests across 3 countries and the disruption of an intelligence network that had been operating for over 5 years. Your intervention that day prevented more than just the theft of sensitive documents, Chen had explained to Morrison during one of their recent meetings. The photographs they were attempting to take would have revealed the identities of British agents operating overseas. Lives would have been lost, operations would have been compromised, and years of intelligence work would have been undone. The ripple effects of Morrison's split-second decision to prioritize the children's safety had extended far beyond the walls of Buckingham Palace. International security agencies had used the intelligence gathered from the captured operatives to identify and neutralize similar threats across Europe, making the world measurably safer. Following the ceremony, Morrison found himself in a private audience with the entire royal family, an unprecedented honor that reflected the personal gratitude they felt for his actions. The Queen, Prince Charles, Princess Diana, and the two young princes gathered in the same study where the incident had occurred, though it had been completely renovated and refurnished since that terrifying morning. "Captain Morrison," the Queen began, her voice carrying the warmth that she reserved for those who had earned her deepest respect. "Your actions that day exemplified the highest traditions of service to the Crown. But more than that, you demonstrated the kind of moral courage that we hope to instill in our own children. For that you have our eternal gratitude." Princess Diana, who had struggled with her own emotions about how close her children had come to serious harm, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "I can never adequately express what it means to a mother to know that someone was willing to sacrifice everything to protect her children. You gave me back my sons, and I will never forget that gift." Prince Charles, who had initially struggled with anger about the security breach that had endangered his family, had come to appreciate Morrison's role in turning a potential catastrophe into a demonstration of the strength and resilience of British institutions. "Captain Morrison, your actions remind us why the bond between the Crown and those who serve it remains unbreakable. You embody the best traditions of British service." As the formal proceedings concluded, Morrison spent additional time with Prince William and Prince Harry, reviewing their progress in the self-defense program and discussing upcoming training scenarios. Both boys had grown noticeably in confidence and maturity since the incident, carrying themselves with a new awareness of their responsibilities and capabilities. "Captain Morrison," William said as they walked through the palace gardens where they often conducted outdoor training exercises, "do you think we'll ever have to use what you're teaching us?" It was a question Morrison had hoped would never arise, but he understood its importance to the boys' developing worldview. "I hope not," he answered honestly. "But if you ever do need these skills, I want you to be prepared. More importantly, I want you to understand that being prepared gives you choices. When you know how to protect yourself and others, you can focus on the positive ways you want to serve your country rather than worrying about potential dangers." Prince Harry, who had been practicing a defensive sequence they had learned the previous week, looked up with the serious expression he wore when processing important concepts. "Will you always be here to teach us and protect us?" Morrison knelt down to the 7-year-old's eye level, understanding that the boy was seeking reassurance about stability and continuity in his life.
"I'll be here as long as you need me, and as long as I'm able to serve.
"But more importantly, I'm teaching you to be strong and smart, so that you can protect yourselves and the people you care about, just like I protected you that day." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of other security personnel, conducting their routine patrols, reminding Morrison that life at the palace had returned to its carefully orchestrated normalcy. The additional security measures implemented after the incident were now invisible to most observers, but they provided layers of protection that made another such breach virtually impossible. As evening approached and Morrison prepared to end his shift, he took a final walk through the corridor, where everything had changed 6 months earlier. The Queen's study bore no resemblance to the room where he had fought for the lives of 2 children and the security of his nation. But the memories remained vivid and powerful. Standing in that hallway, Morrison reflected on how dramatically his life had been altered by a few minutes of violence and heroism. He had begun that March morning as a dedicated but anonymous protector, and he would end his career as a decorated hero and trusted mentor to future kings. The transformation felt both surreal and inevitable, as if everything in his life had been preparation for those crucial moments when courage and training converged. The sound of children's laughter drifted from the family quarters, where William and Harry were probably finishing their evening studies before bedtime. That sound, so different from the frightened voices he had heard that terrible morning, served as a daily reminder of what he had protected and why his sacrifice had been worthwhile. Captain Morrison adjusted his uniform one final time before heading home, carrying with him the satisfaction that came from duty faithfully performed and the knowledge that his actions had secured not just the safety of 2 children, but the continuity of institutions that had served his nation for over 1,000 years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities, but tonight he could rest in the knowledge that when destiny called, he had been ready to answer.